The title of this lecture is What the Buddha Thought, and that title is also the title of a book which I published in 2009, which is available in paperback. It's quite cheap, and it's worth every rupee. And I only have about 50 minutes now to speak to you, and the Buddha had many more thoughts than can be expressed or explained in 50 minutes. So if you would like to hear or learn about some more of them, please turn to my book. Now, the Buddha was a great man, one of the greatest in human history, not merely because of his rational thought, but also because he had a religious experience which inspired him to found what became a world religion, to propagate traditions of meditation and mental training, and to create an institution, the Sangha, which has already embodied his teachings for more than 2.5 millennia. It is about the Buddha as a rational teacher, however, as a rational thinker, that I shall talk today. And I do this because I believe that the Buddha has been more worshipped than appreciated as the great thinker he was. His words have been more mouthed than understood. There are surprisingly many cases in which the Buddhist tradition has not fully grasped the Buddha's meaning, because the commentators and exegetes have failed to take their historical context into account. And modern scholars have so far done little better. I think that once one gives them their place in the history of the development of Indian thought, one comes to see that not only did the Buddha have many brilliant ideas, they also cohered as a whole system of thought and attitude to thinking. Incidentally, there are also points on which he seems to have changed his mind, or at least developed his ideas in the course of a teaching career of 45 years. There won't be time to go into detail about that today, but I think it is exemplary that great people are not afraid to change their minds and not afraid of criticism. And though unfortunately this lecture is entitled Distinguished Lecture, I hope you will forget about that and apply critical thought to what I'm going to say. And incidentally, I would very much welcome questions, comments, or even objections at the end of the talk. You may have noticed that I've been referring to the Buddha as a thinker rather than as a philosopher. I have a reason for that. Like Socrates and most of the great classical Greek philosophers who succeeded Socrates, the Buddha was not interested in philosophical theory for its own sake, but for its practical consequences. His starting point was that we all find our lives unsatisfactory. Moreover, they are a form of imprisonment, since, like nearly all the Indian thinkers of his time, he believed that we are all in a potentially endless cycle of rebirth. Thus, the dissatisfaction of our condition, let us label it suffering, could go on forever. The aim of theorizing must be liberation from this horrible prospect, and your university motto is intended, I suppose, to remind you of that. The Buddha lived probably for 80 years in the 5th century BC. The dominant culture of his environment was that of the Brahmins. According to their own theory of society, the Brahmins constituted a hereditary class, the highest, and owed that position primarily to being the guardians of sacred knowledge. This sacred knowledge was embodied in a large collection of Sanskrit texts known as the Vedas. Veda, in fact, means simply knowledge. Writing was unknown in India at that time, so access to the Vedas was possible only through Brahmins who knew the texts by heart. The Brahmins, their rituals and ideology, provided the Buddha with his main point of reference and were a constant source of metaphor. He even reproached them with falling short of their own ethical ideals, and even sometimes referred to himself as a Brahmin to indicate that it was he who really upheld those ideals. The Buddha lived at a time of dramatic economic change. Agricultural prosperity was producing the first cities since the defunct Indus Valley civilization, city-states and long-distance trade. This trade created awareness of cultures outside India. The Buddha's knowledge that some countries had no caste system and spoke languages unrelated to Sanskrit liberated his outlook. Trade also created social mobility and a new class who needed a religion that neither depended on the service of Brahmin priests nor was tied to local observances and ancient customs. The Buddha was not the first person to found such a religion. When he first preached, there were several preachers and movements which rejected Brahminism. Most, if not all of them, preached that the only road to salvation lay in leaving home and family and living as a wandering ascetic. One of them, Jainism, has of course survived as an autonomous religion to this day. While Brahminism was founded on correct ritual action, which would ensure a good rebirth, it also, not long before the Buddha's time, began to produce what I might call mystico-philosophical texts, the Upanishads. These texts, which are also known as the Vedanta, which means the goal of Vedic knowledge, purported to penetrate the deepest mysteries of the universe, an understanding of which would enable one at death to merge with the highest reality and escape rebirth forever. The Upanishads posit that there is an eternal, unchanging essence to the world which is called Brahman. In the same way, there is a permanent, unchanging essence to each living individual, called Atman. This word, Atman, also serves in Sanskrit as the reflexive pronoun. Hence the problem that it can be translated into English as either soul or self. The salvific gnosis, the realization required, is that one realize that one's Atman is really Brahman. To realize this in life is to realize it in a further sense, that is, to make it real at death. When he dies, the person who has achieved this gnosis is not reborn, but merges into Brahman, and thus is forever rid of all individuation or potential for a separate existence. In this soteriological theory, that is, theory about how one is to be saved, being and becoming are defined as polar opposites. Being is by definition changeless, and becoming is the same as change, is a form of change. Brahman, existence, is a plenum. That means it fills everything with no gaps whatsoever. Brahman is a plenum as it was for the Greek philosopher Parmenides, who flourished around 500 BC or soon thereafter. And Brahman is also bliss, for suffering and unhappiness are considered invariably to be due to some lack. The logic of this argument seems so frail that one is tempted to look elsewhere for the origin of the idea that Brahman is bliss. Maybe it originated in what we call mystical experience. Fully to realize one's identity with Brahman, and hence one's imperishability, is presumably bliss. The Buddha accepted the dichotomy between being and becoming, or at least its negative corollary. For him, the world of our experience is full of change. Moreover, our satisfactions are all transient. Death, both our own death and the death of loved ones, is, alas, always lurking in the background. Thus, change involves suffering, frustration, or at least dissatisfaction. A basic formulation of the Buddha's teaching is known as the 3 hallmarks, in Pali tilakkana. That is, the hallmarks of phenomenal existence, of life as we normally experience it. These hallmarks are impermanence. No matter how long this lecture seems to go on, you know it will end. Unsatisfactoriness and absence of self. The sequence betrays the Upanishadic reasoning. Things are impermanent, that is, ever-changing, and by that token they are not satisfactory. And by that token they cannot be the Atman. To return to the example I gave just now, you wish that the lecture would go on forever, and then it would not be unsatisfactory. Think for a moment whether that is plausible. The Buddha further reasoned that if by definition the self or soul exists, this must mean also that it never changes. It can play no part in the processes that constitute our lives. We cannot even experience it. What we experience is activity, movement, action, karma, and the results of that activity. Thus, those who think that the Buddha's no-soul doctrine denies personal continuity and hence moral responsibility have completely misunderstood. Our continuity consists in our karma. This is probably the strongest theory of personal continuity ever enunciated, for that continuity lasts over an infinite series of lives, which can only be ended by attaining nirvana. Reflecting on the other side of the dichotomy, that is, being, the Buddha made a great intellectual advance. For the Upanishads, only existence is true, is real. The 2 categories, true and real, that they did not distinguish from each other. Becoming is a mixture of being and not being. And so, they argue, what changes is less real than what doesn't. The Buddha decided that the view that there is a category, existence, or being, is a major moral and intellectual impediment. His stricture was later taken to apply only to the view that the Atman exists, but that is wrong. Positing the existence of the Atman was merely a paradigm case of the mistake. The Buddha's stricture amounts to a condemnation of what we now call essentialism. The word karma literally means act or deed. In Brahmanism, Jainism, and Buddhism, karma can be right or wrong. But the 3 religions understand the term differently. All agree, however, that one does a karma, and at some time in the future, in this life or later, one will experience a correspondingly positive or negative result. The underlying metaphor is agricultural. Sow a seed, later receive a harvest. The Buddha's use of the term has accustomed us to assume that karma always has moral value, positive or negative. Good karma will produce good results, bad karma, bad results for the agent. In the Brahminical tradition, karma preserved its meaning of action and referred primarily to ritual action. Good karma was prescribed ritual. Bad karma was something ritually prohibited. In this tradition, karma was not ethicized before the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is probably the oldest Upanishad, a text which the Buddha can be proved to have known. However, the first to ethicize karma were the Jains. They and the Buddhists denied any positive value to ritual. The greatest Jain objection to Brahmin ritual seems to have been to the violence involved in animal sacrifice. Their own view of karma may strike us as bizarre. They, the Jains, ethicized the cycle of rebirth. One is reborn according to one's deserts. What they said was reborn was a soul or life monad, and such souls were found not merely in what we think of as sentient beings, but in every particle of matter, no matter how small. Even by moving around, therefore, one does physical harm to other beings, because you tread even on dust. Therefore, all acts, including ritual acts, must do some harm. Every act attracts something analogous to dust, which clings to the soul and weighs it down. So, to gain release from the cycle of rebirth, samsara, one has to scrub off all the old dust and not let any new dust gather. The scrubbing involves physical austerities, and preventing new dust from gathering means total inaction. Finally, it means even starving to death. While the Buddha was influenced by Jainism, his thought was far more sophisticated. He, the Buddha, showed a capacity for abstraction, which today we may take for granted, but raised Indian thought onto a new plane. Karma for him was not physical, not even action in the normal sense. His single most significant statement was, "By karma I mean intention," a bold reversal of the use of words. We shall see that his capacity for abstraction took him far beyond the assumption that a theory of rebirth required that there be an entity which is reborn. The idea that a mere thought or state of mind could engender karma first appears, though very briefly, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but it took the Brahmin tradition many centuries fully to disentangle ethics from ritual. Ritual rules are always particularistic. They apply to people of specific age, gender, marital status, and so on, and in particular situations. When the Buddha declared that the value of karma lay solely in intention, he disengaged ethics from status and circumstance. He universalized ethical values, since intention, whoever has it, can only be, for him, moral or immoral. He made all living beings ethically equal, in that they all had the same chances, the same responsibilities. However, since he too believed in rebirth, no one at birth starts with a clean slate. We are all, as he put it, heirs of our own deeds. And moral habits formed in the past, over any number of lives, have given us propensities. So it is harder for a drunkard to become sober than for someone who never drinks anyway. But though the effort needed is unequal, each of us has the chance to improve or decline. For the Buddha, morally good intention purifies the mind. A morally advanced person can then undertake such purification directly by meditation. We saw that for the Jains, even good karma is unwelcome in that it keeps one within the cycle of rebirth, even good karma. The Buddha's system is all of a piece. The final goal and result of purifying the mind is to purge it of all selfish emotions and to attain full clarity of understanding. Virtue and understanding are mutually reinforcing. In the text, which passes as the Buddha's first sermon, he briefly enunciates what he calls the Four Noble Truths. The first is suffering, the experience of all living beings. The second is its cause, desire. This both recalls the Upanishadic view that suffering is due to a lack, and also stands in a long tradition that mainly ascribes our sufferings to our emotions our appetites. The root cause of our suffering is that we want things we inevitably will fail to get, such as immortality for our loved ones. The third follows logically. The way to end suffering is to stop desiring. The fourth noble truth describes that way in practical and ethical terms. It has 8 stages and leads from right view, which mainly refers to accepting the Buddha's teaching of karma, via ethical conduct to the mental training which will enable one in the end to achieve the salvific gnosis called nirvana. So what is that gnosis? In metaphorical terms, it is often described as the going out of the fires of passion, hatred, and confusion. When not using such metaphors, the Buddha would agree with the Upanishads only in their apophatic formulation. Apophatic is a word that may not be familiar to all of you. Apophatic is asserting something by way of negation. Not saying something positively is that, but saying it's not something. That's called apophasis, or that's described as apophatic. He would agree with the Upanishads only in their apophatic formulation that the salvific truth can only be described apophatically as not thus, not thus. Neti, neti, na iti, na iti. We have seen that he regarded talk about the category being, and hence reality, as a major impediment to spiritual progress. Moreover, there is a serious ambiguity about Brahman. In all the Brahminical cosmogonies, Brahman initially is a neuter principle, but then, through some unexplained development, that principle, while remaining immanent in all phenomena, also becomes personified as a masculine creator. If it or he is also the creator, he cannot but be involved with change and becoming. The purity of his being is compromised. In other words, we encounter here the paradox of what in the Christian tradition is called the unmoved mover. In fact, this paradox endures throughout the Hindu theistic tradition. God has to be both beyond the world, transcendent and changeless, and immanent in the world which he has created and sustained. Moreover, if the highest truth is that Brahman and Atman are one, then the soul too, the soul of each one of us, becomes an unmoved mover, which is a contradiction in terms. These reasons convinced the Buddha that to convey what he meant by nirvana, it was best to stick to negative language. Since the problem, suffering, was that of each individual person and its solution also lay with the individual, the Buddha saw no need to bring God into it at all. We need not bother, he said, with such theoretical questions as who, if anyone, was or is responsible for the universe. All that matters is to understand that we are responsible for ourselves, we and no one else. Thus, even at the heart of his teaching, the Buddha took a severely practical attitude. He described himself as the surgeon who removes the arrow of craving. He also said that just as the ocean has only one flavor, that of salt, his teaching had only one flavor, that of liberation. When people complained to him that various teachers preached different doctrines to them, so that they were confused about which to follow, he replied that on such matters everyone has to make up their own mind, and to do so one should take nothing on trust, but test it on the touchstone of one's own experience. And I hope that that's the first lesson you all learn when you come to university. When it came to administering the Sangha, he was no less strictly pragmatic. Whenever the Vinaya text, the Vinaya is the Buddhist monastic code, whenever the Vinaya text shows the Buddha disapproving of something, it has him say that it is not conducive to increasing the number of believers. He then pronounces a rule for which he gives a stock list of 10 reasons. And these can be summarized as the protection and convenience of the Sangha, the moral purity of its members, increase in the number of believers, and the good of non-believers. The Buddha was a pragmatist, as we use the term idiomatically, but not in the modern technical philosophical sense. As the scholar Paul Williams has written, there is no suggestion that the teaching is only pragmatically true, that is, that it is only a question of it being beneficial in the context of the spiritual path. The teachings of the Buddha are held by the Buddhist tradition to work because they are factually true. It's not that they're true because they work, which would be pragmatism. Further, Williams writes, the ought, pragmatic benefit, is never cut adrift from the is, cognitive factual truth. Otherwise, it would follow that the Buddha might be able to benefit beings and even bring them to enlightenment without seeing things the way they really are at all. And that is not Buddhism. More than it resembles pragmatism, the Buddha's approach seems to me to resemble the approach of the philosopher of science Karl Popper, whom Professor Dasgupta mentioned in his introduction. In politics and the conduct of public affairs, Popper was against trying to impose a blueprint conceived a priori and recommended instead what he called piecemeal engineering, that is, finding solutions to what had evidently gone wrong. This is exactly how the Buddha's procedure is represented in the Vinaya, that part of the Buddhist canon which lays down the rules for how monks and nuns are to behave, both corporately and individually. In ancient times, codes of law, whether ascribed to a god or to a sage, were normally created fully fledged. The Vinaya is remarkable as a legal system which is not based on a given and unquestionable foundation, but gradually built up through case law. Every rule governing individual conduct is framed to meet a particular situation that has arisen, and the first offender, the person who occasioned the creation of the rule, cannot be guilty because the rule didn't yet exist to be broken. Nor can someone not in their right mind be guilty of an offense. When a rule turns out to have undesirable consequences, the Buddha modifies it or even rescinds it. This is a system of trial and error, of learning from one's mistakes. It proves that the Buddha, despite the protestations of Buddhist followers, did not regard himself as omniscient. The evidence is there in the texts. In matters of doctrine, the parallel with Karl Popper lies not only in the Buddha's anti-essentialism, but also in his method of conveying his ideas. In one text, he says that he doesn't dispute with the world, it's the world that disputes with him. There is, moreover, a set of poems in the canon in which he several times claims to have no views himself, and evidently wishes to avoid disputing the views of others. This isn't typical of the prose texts, but it merely carries to an extreme the Buddha's general strategy of exposition. That strategy is to get an interlocutor to state his own view, and then to correct it, sometimes radically, without making this too obvious. One may summarize this as saying, yes, but wonderful diplomacy. This technique has been admirably described by the great pioneer Pali scholar T.W. Rhys Davids. He wrote, Gautama puts himself as far as possible in the mental position of the questioner. He attacks none of his cherished convictions. He accepts as the starting point of his own exposition the desirability of the act or condition prized by his opponent. He even adopts the very phraseology of his questioner. And then, partly by putting a new, and from the Buddhist point of view, a higher meaning into the words, partly by an appeal to such ethical conceptions as a common ground between them, he gradually leads his opponent up to his conclusion. In later, end of quote. In later Buddhist tradition, this is known as the Buddha's skill in means, and is accorded enormous importance. Any historian of ideas does well to bear this in mind, for it shows how it comes about that the Buddha makes such startling innovations in the use of words. Of this, he's using karma, which we saw literally means act, to refer to intention, is only one example. That the Buddha normally formulated his views with reference to those of predecessors or opponents means that they're easily misunderstood by those who are ignorant of the context. And that indeed has been what has happened. Inevitably, many contexts must be lost to us, so we must presume that we sometimes, even now, misunderstand him, and cannot even be sure when we misunderstand him. Yet, certain meanings have been retrieved by research. A striking example is the Buddha's teaching on 4 states called boundless or abiding with Brahman. The 4 are love, as the term is used in theology, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. The Buddhist tradition has vaguely realized that the Buddha set the highest store by love and compassion, and has adored him accordingly, but has failed to find textual authority for this in the early canon. But it is there, in a text called the Te Vidya Sutta. It has been missed because when the text, originally addressed to 2 young Brahmin converts, says that the monk who practices these states goes to stay with Brahman when he dies, the tradition has taken this literally. Brahman is then taken to be a kind of super god who presides over a heaven above the heavens of the normal gods. And the benign monk is simply thought to be reborn in that heaven. However, it must be clear to anyone who examines the relevant texts that the Buddha is here giving a metaphorical interpretation of a famous passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That passage describes how a person who has attained the salvific gnosis escapes rebirth by going at death beyond the highest heaven to join, perhaps to merge into, Brahman. Whether Brahman is here the neuter principle or its personification as masculine is left ambiguous. The Buddha is teaching the 2 young Brahmins that a spiritual accomplishment is indeed the way to escape rebirth, but that accomplishment is not the realization of a metaphysical fact, their identity with Brahman, but an ethical transformation by which they love all living beings boundlessly, that is to say, equally and infinitely. Thus, the accusation often leveled at the Buddha that he taught people to be selfish, caring only for their own spiritual progress, is shown to be completely misconceived. Some of the Buddha's metaphors have been only partially understood. The outstanding example is his use of fire as the central metaphor for our normal experience, and how to reverse that normality so that we achieve enlightenment and escape rebirth. The Buddha's 3rd sermon, which is known in English as the Fire Sermon, begins with the strange words, "Everything, O monks, is on fire." But the Buddha then explains what he means by everything. Everything is all our faculties, the 5 senses plus the mind, and their objects and operations, and the feelings they give rise to. To paraphrase, everything refers to the totality of experience. All components of our experience in this world, the Buddha declares, are on fire. They are on fire with passion, hatred, and confusion. Most people know that the commonest Buddhist term for the solution to life's problems, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, is called nirvana, and that this term is connected somehow to fire. But what exactly the fire means or refers to has often been misunderstood. The word comes from an intransitive verb meaning cease to burn, to go out like a flame. The noun nirvana means going out, without implying any agent who causes that going out. It's just a happening. In the fire sermon, the Buddha preaches that our experience is on fire with three fires, the fires of passion, hatred, and confusion, and our aim must be for all of those three fires to go out. Sometimes in the canon, the first fire is called passion, sometimes greed, but this variation is not important. The reference is the same, and the fires are always three. Why? Well, the Brahmin householder had the duty to keep alight a set of three fires which he tended daily. The Buddha thus took these fires to symbolize life as a family man. This is stated clearly enough in a canonical text. Here the Buddha first juxtaposes the three sacrificial fires with the fires of passion, hatred, and delusion, and then with the aid of puns, I'm afraid he was rather fond of puns, he metaphorically reinterprets the fires. The Eastern fire, he says, stands for one's parents, the Western fire for one's household and dependents, and the Southern fire for holy men, that is, renunciates and Brahmins, who are worthy to receive offerings. It is in this sense, he tells a fat Brahmin, that a householder should tend the fires, that is, by supporting these people. In the Buddha's first sermon, as it has come down to us, dukkha, suffering, is defined as the five upadana khandha. Upadana khandha. None of you will know these words. Upadana is spelled U-P-A-D-A-N-A, and the second half is khandha, K-H-A-N-D-H-A. This compound noun is a Buddhist technical term which must have required unpacking to be intelligible to its first audiences. In fact, the term conveys the same message as the fire sermon, using the same metaphor. But somehow this was soon forgotten. Khandha means something like a mass. I'll return to it in a moment. The word upadana has both a concrete and an abstract meaning. In the abstract, it means attachment, grasping. In this sense, it is much used in Buddhist dogmatics. Concretely, it means that which fuels this process. The Pali English Dictionary writes of upadana, it is that material substratum by means of which an active process is kept alive and going. Fuel. So when the context deals with fire, it simply means fuel. So, is suffering really five masses of fuel? We have seen that in the fire sermon, the Buddha summons up our experience in terms of our faculties, that is, the senses plus the mind, their objects, operations, and consequent feelings, and says that all are on fire. In the canon, there's an even commoner way of referring to what makes up the experience of any living being. This is in terms of five khandha, the second half of that noun, whatever the term may mean. And the five are materiality, that's the five senses and their objects, feelings as of pleasure and pain, apperception, which means perceiving and identifying what is perceived, volitions, that is, emotions, of which the will in its moral aspect is the most important, and finally consciousness. Given that the Buddha denied that we could experience a self in the Upanishadic sense of an unchanging essence, the five khandha, that list of five things from materiality to consciousness, have been interpreted as a reductive account of the components of a living being. But Sue Hamilton's research has clearly demonstrated that this is not accurate. No, they are the five components of all conscious experience. They are not what we're made of, they are how we operate. Moreover, the difference between them is analytical. In practice, they always operate together, as a synergy, to use the modern word. The term khandha has usually been rendered in English as aggregates, a term which I think is meaningless. In my opinion, it is clear that this word too was a part of the fire metaphor. There is a short text which states that the five khandha are ablaze, so that one should stop caring about them. Pali has a common expression for a blazing fire or bonfire, aggi khandha, and aggi means fire. In the compound upadana khandha, I believe aggi has been dropped because it's felt to be redundant when the word for fuel is present. I therefore translate upadana khandha as blazing masses of fuel. And indeed, in another short text, our sufferings, our dukkha, are called dukkha khandha, a blazing mass of suffering, and are compared to a bonfire which will only go out after one has stopped feeding it fuel. And that fuel, of course, is of course the passion, hatred, and delusion which affect those five elements of how we operate. In this instance, the Buddha has used fire as a metaphor with entirely negative connotations. It is bliss for the fire to go out. However, in another context, he builds on more complex ideas about fire, ideas which go far back into Vedic thought. Here, fire is no mere metaphor, but the model which inspires his understanding of reality. For the Buddha derived from fire the inspiration that what appears to be a thing is in fact a process. That it is a process which acts without an agent, and that its operation is neither wholly determined nor wholly random. Now, this has got people very excited in the 21st century for stupid reasons, but it is very striking that this is exactly the picture of the world provided for us by modern physics. But that does not mean, of course, that the Buddha foresaw modern physics and all its wonders at all. He worked out the same thing by reasoning, and in a way, at this particular point, the coincidence is just as it were a piece of luck. But that says nothing to denigrate the brilliance of the Buddha's thought. I'll repeat, the Buddha derived from fire the inspiration that what appears to be a thing, such as Richard Gombrich or this table, is in fact a process. That it is a process which acts without an agent, like fire, and that its operation is neither wholly determined nor wholly random, but in the middle way between those two. In one text, the Buddha compares consciousness to fire. Consciousness, he says, is classified, one might say named, according to what has brought it about. If it arises on account of the eye and visible forms, it counts as eye consciousness. Similarly, there arise ear consciousness, smell consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, from the sense of touch, and mind consciousness, the last being due to the mind and ideas. Just so, a fire is classified according to its cause, whether it be a stick fire, a splinter fire, a grass fire, a cow dung fire, a chaff fire, or a rubbish fire. The Buddha is saying then that consciousness is always consciousness of something. And this is the opposite of the Upanishadic doctrine that consciousness is inherent in the world spirit, Brahman, and therefore in the individual soul, Atman, which is ultimately identical with Brahman. The point is twofold. For the Upanishads, consciousness is not consciousness of anything outside itself, but the prerequisite for such consciousness. And it is inextricably bound up with true being, so that ontology, the subject of what exists, and epistemology, the subject of what can we understand, are merged. Whether or not we agree with the Buddha in considering that consciousness must always be consciousness of something, there is no doubt that by separating ontology from epistemology, he is taking a point with which we modern people feel at home. In Vedic tradition, consciousness and its objects are thought of in terms of fire. The Buddha draws on this idea, but is more analytical. He sees consciousness as being like a fire, in that it is an appetitive process which cannot exist without having something to feed on, and it seeks out that which it feeds on. Moreover, the analogy with fire can provide a model of how a process can be dynamic, seek out its objects without being guided by a seeker. Similarly, when there is no more fuel, the fire will go out. And that doesn't mean that anyone has to extinguish it. As a process also, fire is inseparable from what burns. Just as there is no such thing as fire without a burning object, there's no such thing as consciousness without an object. This insight the Buddha then generalized by saying that the subjective and objective presuppose each other, and all experience requires both. It is an interaction of both the subjective and the objective. The thought that subject and object cannot be separated seems to accord with the Buddha's statement that the world lies within this fathom-length body. For us, the world is our experience of the world. Thus, the Buddha realized, I repeat, that the subjective and the objective presuppose each other, that our world is composed of experience, which is constituted by both. He further deduced something that I think was never explicit either in Vedic thought or in its Hindu descendants, that what we can experience is only process. Our consciousness and its objects are like fire in that they are not things but processes, that is, unceasing change. Something beyond this is perhaps conceivable, but the very nature of our apparatus for having experiences determines that if that does exist, it must lie completely outside our experience. If I state the matter so baldly, I am open to challenge. Where does the Buddha say that what we experience, short of attaining nirvana, is only process? True, he says it's impermanent, and on an extreme interpretation that can be taken to mean that it is forever changing. But is that process? Where is the word process in Pali, you can ask? I have to agree that no one word precisely corresponds to process, because the concept was really invented by the Buddha. I argue that much the same ground, however, is covered by the word sankhara, which refers not only to the fourth khandha, where I've translated it as volitions, but also far more broadly to every element in our world of experience. I can't here before you discuss its philological complexities, but I have suggested in my book that sankhara is one of the class of words like the English word construction, which can refer both to a process and to its results. This catches the Buddha's insight that our experiences are both constructed and constructing. The application of this insight that most concerned him was the moral one, karma. What we do makes us what we are. That intention is the most important factor in the fourth khandha is no mere arbitrary accident. That fire is a process which may help to explain both life and consciousness was an idea that the Buddha could find in Vedic texts, but his ethicization of the idea gave it far greater precision. Creating the conditions in which the fires with which we are all burning would go out was an enterprise at the same time ethical and intellectual. For the fires were both emotional, passion and hatred, and intellectual, confusion, stupidity. Egotism and belief in an unchanging ego were the essential fuel of the fires. So once they were got rid of, those fires would just die. I find here a striking analogy with the pre-Socratic philosophers. I have noted the similarity between Parmenides and the Vedantic view of Brahman. In Ionia, Heraclitus argued that fire was the basic element, the stuff from which everything came and into which it returned. He shared the Buddha's insight that our world is in constant flux. It is a world of processes. Heraclitus was probably responding to Parmenides, just as the Buddha was responding to the Upanishads. I do not believe that Heraclitus could have influenced the Buddha, let alone the other way around. But in ancient Greece too, fire inspired someone to envision a world of perpetual change. Everything then in our lives and experiences is process. Can one be any more specific? The Buddhist tradition holds that the Buddha's distinctive insight was that all phenomena are causally conditioned. This discovery has two main formulations. One amounts to saying that everything, except nirvana, which isn't really a thing, arises from a cause. It follows from this that the world can have no beginning and can have no prime mover. Moreover, the fact that nothing exists independently of causes can be expressed as a middle way between the propositions everything exists and nothing exists. Remember that the Buddha takes being and becoming as opposites. The other formulation is known as the chain of dependent origination, paticcasamuppada. It starts with our suffering, notably decay and death, and asks what causes it, and then in turn traces that to a cause, and that to a cause, and so on back to ignorance. The ignorance is failing to grasp the Buddha's message. Here the causes are in fact necessary but not sufficient conditions. We can call them preconditions. Without each link, the next one cannot arise, but its occurrence does not guarantee the next one. One may snap the chain by attaining nirvana. This doctrine primarily concerns the individual rather than things in general. Since things in general are of interest only insofar as they are experienced by the individual, this is not important to the Buddha. Nevertheless, one may comment that this is soteriology rather than philosophy. Nothing interesting is being said about causality as such. But philosophically, this serves as the paradigm case of how the world consists of processes, and those processes are not random, but nor are they rigidly determined. They fall within limits, limits set by preconditions. The most important application of this idea is to karma. It is the Buddha's answer to the problem of free will. If everything is determined so that we have no choice, morality collapses, and with it collapses the whole of the Buddha's teaching. But unless actions and intentions have non-random consequences, there is no path towards nirvana. There's no reason for doing good, and no solution to the problem of suffering. So here again, the Buddha's theorizing takes us only as far as is required for practical purposes. It's much like our legal system in that way. So I come to my summary. Again and again, the Buddha transformed earlier religious ideas and practices by saying that if properly understood, they were about ethics. But he often did this with such subtlety that it's not surprising if his maneuvers were not always understood by his followers. And the most important instance of this is his doctrine of karma. Karma is about moral causation. First and foremost, it is a teaching of responsibility. And so it has to be compatible with free will. But even the exercise of free will is by no means a random process. What we sow determines what we reap. It doesn't do so rigidly, for karma is not the only cause of our pleasure and pain. Our karma determines the general conditions, such as where we are born, a framework within which more obvious kinds of cause, such as disease, take effect. When it comes to new karma, we can choose, but only within limits. The most important of which we have ourselves established through our former choices. Those choices are necessary but not sufficient conditions for our subsequent acts of choice. A proverb cited by Damien Keown puts it admirably: sow an act, reap a habit; sow a habit, reap a character; sow a character, reap a destiny. Putting karma at the center of the person, the Buddha replaced a static and amoral hypothetical entity, the self, by a process much of which we can observe and experience in action. This process is in constant interaction with the environment. Modern psychology holds that every action is an interaction with the world and affects the actor. The Buddha did not go so far when it came to discussing perception and cognition, but he did develop this insight in the context of karma. Moreover, while he identified our world with our experience, his preaching that each person was responsible for his or her own karma and could only reach nirvana by their own efforts was incompatible with idealism. In sum, I see the doctrine of karma as the pivotal point of the Buddha's teaching and the one to which almost all his thought relates. Thank you for your attention.